Welcome to African American History, Lesson 13. In this lesson we will describe the conditions of the three-part journey that enslaved Africans endured during the transatlantic slave trade and will also explain how the transatlantic slave trade destabilized West African societies. Enslaved Africans' journeys to the Americas varied. In the first part of the journey, which could last several months, Africans were captured and marched from interior states to the Atlantic coast. On the coast, some captives waited in crowded, unsanitary dungeons. The second part of the journey, the Middle Passage, involved traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, which lasted up to 3 months. For most, the Middle Passage established permanent separation from their communities. Aboard slave ships, Africans were humiliated, beaten, tortured, and raped, and they suffered from widespread disease and malnourishment. About 15% of captive Africans perished during the Middle Passage. The third or final passage occurred when those who arrived at ports in the Americas were quarantined, resold, and transported domestically to distant locations of servitude, a process that could take as long as the first and middle passages combined. Sometimes, especially during discussions surrounding possible reparations for the descendants of slaves, apologists for the transatlantic slave trade will argue that reparations are unwarranted because many Africans were sold into slavery by other Africans. While that is somewhat true, this is a question that deserves closer analysis. Before European involvement, various forms of slavery and servitude existed in African societies, often as a result of warfare, debt, or punishment for crimes. However, the large-scale demand for enslaved people by European traders created new economic incentives that intensified internal conflicts and raiding. European traders provided firearms, textiles, alcohol, and other goods in exchange for enslaved individuals, making the trade highly profitable for African elites and warlords. As African tribal leaders received more firearms from European traders, the influx of weapons led to more conflicts among African states and groups. As a result, African rulers and warlords received greater incentives to capture and sell the members of other tribes that they had defeated in battle in exchange for more European goods. Before Europeans introduced the idea of trading human beings as a source of economic income, traditional African slavery was quite different. Traditional African servitude was more similar to the European practice of having indentured servants. Captives could retain many of their basic rights and potentially work their way toward freedom. Additionally, those used as domestic servants were generally not viewed as property, but were often regarded as members of their master's household, almost equal to actual family members. This form of African enslavement system very likely would have continued had it not been for the influence and greed of European traders. Some African rulers became reliant on the trade, prioritizing it over other economic activities and consolidating power through military dominance. So while it is true that Africans were not passive participants and had their own agency in the transatlantic slave trade, the overwhelming external demand from European traders played a key role in reshaping and intensifying slavery within Africa. Another impact of the transatlantic slave trade was that some coastal African states became wealthy from trade in goods and people, while some interior states became less stable under the constant threat of capture and enslavement. To maintain local dominance and grow their wealth, African leaders sold soldiers and war captives from opposing ethnic groups. However, this left all of Africa more vulnerable to European colonization, since community members with military experience were no longer present to help in defending their regions against European invaders. Formerly enslaved Africans detailed their experiences in poetry and a genre known as slave narratives. Slave narratives are foundational to early American writing and serve as historical accounts, literary works, and political texts. As political texts, slave narratives were designed to end slavery and the slave trade, demonstrate black humanity, and to advocate for the inclusion of people of African descent in American society. Two works that can provide great insight into the horrors of the Middle Passage are the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano and an account of the slave trade on the coast of Africa by Alexander Falconbridge. Olaudah Equiano was a former enslaved man who described the inhumane conditions and suffering endured during the journey across the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas. Alexander Falconbridge was a ship surgeon who documented the brutality that he witnessed firsthand on slave vessels. Although the institution of slavery would not be completely abolished until the latter half of the 19th century in the United States and Europe, these first-hand accounts by Equiano and Falconbridge did help to end the practice of importing new slaves from Africa. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, and share it on social media. You can also subscribe to the channel at Quietly Radical on YouTube to be notified whenever new videos are released. Please join us next time when we will discuss the topic African resistance on the slave ships and the anti-slavery movement.